Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the very first session of our 2025 Textile of the Month group. We're going to be starting a short series for a couple of programs on dealing with types of manipulated warp and weft, meaning ones that are nudged one side or another, to create both gauze-like weaves, but not necessarily gauze. They're not straight weaves where the weft is straight from selvage to selvage or the warp straight. We're going to be bumping them and nudging them in different directions. And there are many different textiles that all have generally the same appearance, but are created very differently. And so that's what I want to point out to you so that you can appreciate what we're looking at. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the video here. Okay, there we go. So I'm hoping that that's showing up on the screen. Yeah, they can now see that. And we'll start. Okay, so again, Textile of the Month, Series 3, 2025, January. And we're going to be talking about Kushi-ori. Kushi means comb, as in combing your hair. So I'm going to stop here just a second. I want you to look at this blue part. Now, I realize that's not a really clear shot, but as we're moving along, I want you to pay attention to it. It looks like, the best I can say is it looks like a bunch of clothespins that have been lined up. They are teeth to a comb that are somewhat triangular, pointed, dagger-like in shape. Okay, so watch what she's doing there. She's using the blue comb, the teeth of the comb, to push down into the warp threads. Now, because these are cone-shaped rather than straight, as you see in the insert here, as the point hits the warp and pushes down, it nudges the warp thread to the right or left, okay? And depending on where she picks up that blue comb and replaces it, she can nudge back and forth and create this kind of variation in it. It has a very random look, but it takes a great deal of skill to keep it looking consistently, evenly random. Okay, so we have several different shots. Now, I know a few of you may not be weavers, and I want you to take note of what's happening here. She's using a heddle, the part that has the string wrapped onto it, and she's actually doing sort of a tapestry weave here. So we're not really talking about that as part of our topic today. But as she adds this additional weft thread in, she's going to have a warp thread fly left to right. Whoops, I guess it wasn't in there. Basically, what she's done is she's taking her shuttle, as she weaves her little section, she's going to take an automated shuttle with the black thread and send it all the way across and then all the way back, and then weave her supplemental weft a little bit more, and then shuttle the black thread to the left and to the right, all the way across the selvage, so that the weave structure maintains its integrity. Now, as she lifts and lowers that blue comb, you can see, this is not the same piece, of course, you can see in this additional insert how these warp threads are no longer straight up and down, they're nudged to the side. In this case, many colored threads are used. Other cases, the warp threads are all a solid color. But what it winds up doing is it opens gaps between those threads. Okay, so here she's going at it again. And she doesn't use the comb to beat the threads. Okay, there's a beater bar and back that she's using. Okay, now let's see if I can catch her using her. Okay, I'll give you a little bit different shot here. Oh, the other thing I should mention is the warp threads are dampened. Okay, it's the friction between the dampened warp thread and the dry weft thread that keeps the warp threads in position. If both, because these are silk, if both are dry and slippery, what's going to happen is when the comb goes down and pushes them aside and lifts up, because of the tension, the warp will just snap right back into position. But because the warp threads are dampened, it creates friction and hygroscopy, okay, the dampness in the warp is being sucked up by the dry weft and kind of temporarily gluing them together. That keeps everything in place until she's gone on to the next stage. And of course, she's using a mirror here to help keep track. Now, right here is the shuttle I mentioned that will have the black thread, and that gets shot to the other side to keep the web's weave structure in place. Okay, this might give you a little bit better shot of the teeth of the comb. Can you see the shape of them? In this case, these are plastic ones. Now, this section right here, okay, those aren't narrow at the bottom and wide at the top. They're all evenly spaced so that she also has the ability to splay out yarns in selected regions only, and we'll get into that in a moment. Okay, so here she's at the end of her weaving. She's going to take the temples off. The temples function like shinshi in our weaving. It keeps the fabric at an even width as she progresses. Okay, so she'll pull those off and then go ahead and cut the bolt from the loom. Now notice for those of you who aren't weavers, notice she has this extra section woven here that she's not removing from the warp. That way she doesn't have to attach all of her warp threads. So you weave a little bit of extra so that she can continue on to the next project without having to rethread everything. Okay, so here's her finished piece. All of this orange, light blue and stuff is that supplemental design that she added, and it's the dark blue part that is actually the portion we're talking about. So perhaps you can see it best at the bottom here. Again, all these butterflies and mist and stuff is additional embellishment, which often occurs with this type of Kushi-ori. But right in here, you can see some of the undulation line, and maybe right where this light is shining through, you get a better shot of it. So let's go into several more examples to give you a better idea. This is similar to the approach she's taken, where all of this silver, gold, and these little tendrils here are additional weaving. That's also done with her comb tamping in place, but we'll get into that in just a moment. And here you see these warp threads that have been shifted. They've been bruised and moved aside using the comb that she has attached to the loom. This is a more contemporary piece. And you can see even a little bit of that going on right here within the silver. And this will give you a little bit better detailed shot. So what happens when these threads are all evenly spaced, loosely spaced, but evenly, when that comb tooth comes down, what it does is it scrunches them all together in one spot and it opens them up in the other. And so depending on how far down she pushes the comb will determine how much they're nudged to the side, because the comb is very wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. So just a little tiny bit will nudge them a little bit. All the way down will shove them way to the side, clustering them all in a group as you see here. This is more obvious when multiple colors are used. Quite often, this is also a lino weave as well to keep everything locked in place. That's a separate weaving technique we covered in the past, of course. Okay, so here's a very simple version. Basically, if we didn't know the history of this, and I came across a bolt of this fabric, let's say at a garage sale or something, I'd pass it right by. Looks like junk. It's bruised. It's old. It's poorly structured. Okay, but that's the aesthetic of this piece. This type of weave was often, well, it was developed for use in the No theater, where there are several characters who play fishermen or impoverished peasants, and you don't really want to dress them in gold brocades and things for the theater. So they developed this weave for their clothing that looks like old rags, even if it's a very highly time-consuming technical weave to produce. And here again, you can see the clustering of the threads, and here's where she plunged the tooth in the deepest to really spread it out. Now here's another example, much more randomized, using many different colors. If you wanted to reproduce this yourself without going to the trouble of working with a comb, what you could always do, of course, is buy a very inexpensive, very, very loose weave, and simply with your fingers, push it back and forth and physically bruise the yarns. You would wind up with a very similar look. So here's an older gentleman who wove this piece, okay? And you can see there's no repeat whatever in the randomized manner in which he's treated these stripes, and that's considered the beauty of the entire piece. It almost has a flowing stream look to it. Okay, here's a much more elaborate piece done with gold threads, many different colors, and so the spreading of the yarns and the clumping of the yarns creates almost a watermark look, as you've seen in French silks and so forth. But here's a better shot showing you how very extremely the threads have been shoved aside to the right and the left, creating this undulation. Okay, so here's a very simple bolt, simple appearing. These are natural dyes. For those of you who are dyers, what the label here says is it says it's natural dyes, okay? And then down below here, it says Yama Kushi-nashi, and then it says Airozome. So it's talking about mountain gardenias and indigo. Now, I do use kushi-nashi quite a bit myself in my own dyes. I'm more familiar with it giving yellows. And of course, indigo gives the blues for how she's using it. So how they got the purple, I'm not quite sure. But that's what it says on it. She would, of course, need a red with the blue to get the purples like that. So let's look at this. Very consistently, very evenly, the warp has been distorted. But even when I say very evenly and consistently, look at how some of them are sort of football shape and others are melon shaped. Okay, it's not as even as we might think because it is done with this tedious moving of the comb throughout the entire bolt. And keep in mind as well that the warp thread is drying out as you're working, and you need to continually monitor the moisture level to make sure that the threads you're nudging aside stay in place. I mentioned earlier the very end of the comb that had tines poking down that were not cone-shaped, okay? So if you create a comb bar like that, and you have some hanging down straight that are not cone-shaped, others that are cone-shaped, and you create a pattern out of those, that allows you to have non-undulating areas such as this, partially undulating like this, and largely undulating like this. Okay, so you're able to create different types of patterning, stripes and so forth using the undulation. Now, because of the method, you're not going to wind up with a very flat weave. You're still having some distortion, and of course, that's part of the beauty. Okay, and this gives you a close-up of that striped portion. In this shot, you can see that the warp threads are quite a bit heavier than the weft. It's the warp that's creating the visual interest. Okay, so let's move on now. What we've covered so far have been warp comb weaves. Okay, now we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time do it with the weft instead. And these are considered two entirely different techniques. The warp one is normally called yoroke. Yoroke means drunken walk, okay, staggering, so meandering kind of look. And you can see the erratic path that some of that took does look a bit like someone staggering after an all-night binge. And so now what we're going to take a closer look at that no theater type costume, which is what this is. And in this case, it's the weft that is undulating. But again, now last time the warp was the heavier of the threads and the weft was very thin because the weft is really just holding it in place. We've reversed that now because it's the weft that creates the beauty and the movement. It's heavier and more pronounced. In the beginning, you saw not only the comb bar that went selvage to selvage, but you also saw the little homemade one that looked like, I don't know, zombie teeth or something, snaggletooth, okay? So this is actually the type of comb that was originally used. This is a woman's hairdressing comb. This happens to be a piece made by Anthony Kleisis in North Dakota. I had him make them for me, imitating the Japanese ones. But it's essentially the same. Now, the comb portion, the teeth, are used for tamping down and distorting. But in this case, this little rat tail end of the comb is also very important because you can flip it around and adjust threads and pick them up just a little bit more or squash them down just a little bit more to create distortion. So both ends of the comb are very important. I do have those on my website, but you can use a standard Japanese type of comb like this. You can find what angel food cake cutter would work, or an Afro pick comb would work. All of those things will work just fine. See how, again, randomized the picking seems to be, while at the same time creating an overall movement. Okay, and this gives you the overall shot. Now, this is the actual width of the obi. Most of these things are from my collection. And so this shows you the actual width of the detail we just looked at. Okay, and the same thing here. We will be covering, next time or the time after, I've forgotten at the moment, we will be covering what's called nami-ori, which means wave weaving. And those are using shaped beater bars. That's not what this is. And I'll come back to this in that session later, because even though these are wave shapes, if you take a close look at them, you can see there's nothing even about them. All of them have that bruised, spontaneous, non-reproducing, non-repetitive look to them. This one's also done with sort of a sparkly copper-colored thread, which is really quite beautiful, very subtle. Except in the theater, if you're using these for obi, almost all of them do require a backing to them so that they don't continue to bruise. Okay. Very open. Okay. This one's, I think, is quite beautiful in its flowing nature and the use of the colors and the shading. Even though it's normally going to be traversing selvage to selvage with this, there are some, like right here. Okay, see this red thread that comes and terminates there. So quite often this will employ tapestry-like techniques where the shuttle will pick through to this point and then make an about face and go back to the selvage again. So not everything continues selvage to selvage, depending on the sculpted quality of the piece. But it is still weft manipulated. Then we can have real simple shapes. Okay, that's great. But we can also go back, as I just mentioned, and incorporate other techniques, whether it's a tapestry-like one, or this one is a little bit more akin to the mitsuzure that we talked about last year. And if you look very closely, you have all this open, manipulated weft thread. And then they've gone back here with a tapestry weave and inserted this little man on his boat. That's quite common to combine all of these techniques. So here you can see the lighthouse and the little peninsula there with the fellow out on his skiff. Very, very simple design. Okay, and here's a little bit more folksy pattern. Has a feeling of a farmhouse with the pastures down below. even the tapestry techniques will often have manipulated weft threads. Now, we're also going to be covering, I think this is in March, a technique called Kushi-ori. The term sku means to scoop up something. And so what's happening in Kushi-ori is that the mini shuttle is used as a pick to raise the different warp threads and pass the weft through. Now, when you do that, generally, those are all tamped down in place so that the weft threads remain straight and even all the way across, no matter how many segments you have. So what distinguishes this particular one from Kushi-ori is that they're not straight. They're bruised and manipulated and moving in a way that you don't see in Kushi-ori. You know, sort of fact of the matter is, a lot of Japanese use the terms interchangeably. So I'm giving you hard and fast definitions that are totally arbitrary. I'm using it to help you understand the technique I'm presenting, but those boundaries are a lot more fuzzy in Japan. So I'm approaching this from a somewhat Western point of view where I'm focusing on the technique to help define the terminology for the process. In Japan, that's not always so. It's a lot more loosey-goosey there, okay? And so don't be surprised or frustrated if someone insists it's some other technique, okay? There's a lot of crossover. Now, in this example, I think you can probably see the beige undulating lines creating the wave shape that we've talked about. You can see these inserted colors as a supplemental weft. But what's going on here with this sort of taupe color is they've painted the warp before weaving. So that's not a weaving technique. They've simply gone in and added some interest through stenciling or hand painting to create this kind of overall look. Okay. And of course, using different thicknesses of threads also helps a lot. This is a good example of that. This particular black and white piece has a number of different yarns used. Some are metallic, some are flossy, fluffy types. Others are very hard, shiny types. Okay, so as we start to wind up here, I want to end with this piece that I'm really very fond of. You have, one of the reasons I'm fond of it is these little birds are called chidori. They're shorebirds, and they're always associated with waves. So here you have the waves woven in with the little insert of the chidori. I think plovers might be what they're called in English. You have the chidori woven in this tapestry technique. You have this other tapestry technique creating these surging waves and so forth, and the different colors of patterning in the background. It's a very, very simple technique, but really kind of a heartwarming, nostalgic kind of technique at the same time. Okay, so that pretty much covers it for the talk today. What I'm going to go ahead and do is, let's see, we'll stop the share. And we'll go back to, we'll go ahead and cut this out for the YouTube presentation. I'll bring all of you back on and we can do our questions and answers. Okay, so there we go. Any questions from any of that now? Oh, let's see.